Hello, BookTube. My name is Nathan Knapp, and today you and I are going to have a discussion about Dan Simmons' The Abominable. I've watched a few reviews of this and read a few different reviews online, and I'm not so much doing a review of The Abominable so much as you and I are going to have a discussion about this because wow, is Dan Simmons ever doing interesting stuff in this book, which I haven't really heard a lot of people talk too much about. This is my first Dan Simmons book, and it might seem like a strange one to start with, and maybe it is, but for various reasons, I have recently become fairly obsessed with everything to do with alpinism, with mountain climbing, mountains in general. And it's strange because I've never actually had much of an interest in mountains or mountain climbing until very recently. And so the reasons why I've suddenly become interested in this are kind of separate from the book discussion. But my point here is that I am the ideal reader for The Abominable. So if you don't know very much about it, basically this book has a whole lot to do with mountain climbing. It is a suspense novel, but like many of Simmons's works, it is doing this very interesting thing where it is blending historical fiction with fiction. And where there are gaps in our understanding of history, he's filling them in with very clever pieces of fiction that certainly like you can't disprove. And when he's able to add in like in The Terror, then he's able to add in some supernatural stuff. And with this, then it's not so much that he's trying to do supernatural stuff, but boy, there's some outlandish stuff that comes up in the book. So if you are the type of person who thinks that knowing anything about the book or knowing the ending is going to ruin it, like as in the idea of spoilers, then this is probably not the best video, because I want to have more of a discussion about the book than just a straight up review and trying to encourage you or discourage you from reading it. So let me start getting into it. The reason why I say that I am an ideal reader is that the criticism of the book is that if you are not interested in mountain climbing or the history of mountain climbing or the Himalayas in general, then you are going to be bored to tears for long sections of the book. And some people have criticized that, but I don't think that's a fair criticism, because to me, what you're saying is that's not a commentary on whether he is doing a good job, an effective or an ineffective job of providing you with the history and providing it to you through interesting characters and a good narrative. Instead, it's just saying, I find this topic boring, therefore it's a bad book. And to me, that's not what makes it something a good book or a bad book. And so what I had actually read just before this, which I'm going to do a separate review video for it, is Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air, which has to do with the disaster on Mount Everest that happened in the late 90s. And so if you know a fair bit or a moderate amount about the Himalayas and mountain climbing, then I think you'll be interested. Now, here's what blew me away about the book. He is combining historical fiction with fiction, and he's doing it so effectively that it actually staggers me. I've read other books similar to this, like where there's a similar technique of trying to say, I'm going to take a historical time period and then I'm going to inject fictional characters into it. And so, for example, I mean, like just a really easy way of thinking about this, which isn't a book, but the movie Titanic, James Cameron's film, then this does it, where you've got a couple characters who are on the Titanic, and he's trying to give you as much historical accuracy about what happened with the Titanic as he possibly can, but at the same time, you're following fictional characters, and it's like you can't disprove that story happened. And if you're interested in the history of the Titanic, then you really enjoy the film. But if you just want to follow an interesting story of two characters, you know, who are kind of like doomed lovers, then it works on that level too. So I'm saying other people have done this, but I've never seen it done as well as he did it. And I'll show you how he started doing this. Even the paratext of this, so the text is what actually like happens from either chapter 1 or the prologue until the ending of the book, the novel proper. Everything else beyond that is paratext. And so like the cover, the spine, the back cover, this is all paratext. But on top of that, that would be an introduction by the author, a dedication about the author. This is all not technically the story, right? It's attached to the novel, but it's not the story itself. He's already injecting fiction into it. And this is where I'm saying that I'm possibly spoiling it for you. He dedicates the book. He writes, "This book is dedicated with respect to the memory of Jake William Perry, April 2nd, 1902 to May 28th, 1992. And then he's got a quote from William Blake, "Great things are done when men and mountains meet." Okay, again, if you don't want spoilers, stop watching. Jacob Perry isn't real. He dedicated the book to a fictional character because even though it's not a horror novel, and again, here's another spoiler, there is no abominable snowman. That a lot of people are disappointed because they're like, where on earth is the Yeti at the end of the book? And it's like, it doesn't actually have that. It's not that book. But this is still very much a horror trope. This is trying, it's almost, in a sense, it's similar to what you have with found fiction or with found footage, where you've got found footage movies like the classic one is the Blair Witch Project. And the idea is doing everything that you can, being as deliberate as possible to make the viewer believe that what they're actually watching on screen is real footage of an actual disaster. And what he's trying to do here is trying to convince you, even in the paratext, to take the dedication of the book and then to dedicate it to a fictional character is crazy to me, because no matter how good of a writer you are, no matter how fast you can write, you're only going to have a finite number of books in your writing career. And to take one of your dedications and instead of, dedicating it to a family member or a close friend or something like that, to give it to a fictional character in order to convince the reader that what they are reading is a true story, that's crazy. And then he gets into the introduction. Okay. So the introduction to me is wild because he's talking about himself as Dan Simmons. Now, I've been concurrently reading Carrie and Comfort, and so at the beginning of Carrie and Comfort, he's got like the edition that I'm reading has got a 20 something page introduction, and it's really just going over the publication history of it and what it took for him to bring it into publication. So then you get another like 20 page introduction in this. And so I had read the introduction in Carrie and Comfort, and I just thought, okay, he does this. He's got these very long introductions, going in, but this is just him in the first person, Dan Simmons, explaining what was going on with himself at the time of writing. And that's what I think I'm getting, because he basically says, I wanted to write this book, The Terror, and I wanted to learn all about, these, like the expedition, Franklin's doomed expedition to go through, like, to find the Northwest Passage. And then his wife encourages him. She supposedly, like, meets this guy who has this experience in Antarctica, and then he argues with her about this idea of, like, well, Antarctica is, like, literally the complete opposite pole of the Earth than what I want to research. And she's like, cold is cold, so, just interview him. And so basically he goes and interviews this guy, Jake Perry. And then, like, I genuinely believed that he was a real person. And I'm like, oh, okay, I don't know about Jake Perry, because I know a decent amount at this point about the history of mountain climbing. Like, I know the big names, and I know the major expeditions that you had, like Mallory's expedition, and I think it was 23, and, like, certainly, like, Edmund Hillary in the 50s, when Everest was actually summited. And so I'm like, I don't know who this guy is, but the way he sets it up is, oh no, he's an obscure figure that not very many people have ever heard of him, and he's going to die in obscurity if it weren't for me, Dan Simmons. And I'm going to then use his private journals, his memoirs that he has shared with no one else on earth. This man, this fictional character, but you don't think he's a fictional character. Jake Perry gives Dan Simmons his journal entries about what happened to him on Everest in, I think it was 1924, is when this is happening. And so this is the way he sets it up. And this is where I'm just going to read the last part of the introduction here, because he does such a good job of this. Because Jacob Perry says, like, I want you to publish this stuff. And so then Dan Simmons says, after pondering his wishes for months, I've decided to publish 2 versions of Jacob Perry's final and only manuscript. In the end, I've decided that publication is what he would have wanted after spending the last 10 months of his life laboring over the effort. I also believe it's why he chose me as his primary reader. He knew that I could judge whether a manuscript deserved publication or not. I believe with all my heart that Jacob Perry manuscript, this book, does deserve that publication. A second and very limited edition will show Mr. Perry's own handwriting and will include the scores of sketches, portrait drawings, carefully done maps, mountain landscapes, old photographs, and other elements that Mr. Perry has added to the text. This version will be of text alone. I think it succeeds in telling the story that Jacob Perry, again 1902 to 1992, wanted me to hear, wanted us to hear. As his editor, I've made only a few spelling corrections and added very few explanatory notes to his text. I can only trust and hope that in allowing me to be his first reader and editor, Mr. Perry understands my own hunger to allow others to read this strange and oddly beautiful testament. I do think this is what he wanted. I can only hope to God that it was. So here's where I think it gets fascinating. It's only at the end of this where I was reading and I went, you tricked me. I don't know how it happened, because I have read a lot of books in my life and I haven't been tricked like that in a long time. And I think in part, like I say, it's because I had read his introduction in Carrying Comfort and I just thought, this is an introduction. This isn't the novel itself. But where does this novel begin? Where does it start being a novel? And like I say, it's actually becoming, it is a novel with the dedication. And then the introduction and the structure of this is what I really am fascinated by. So then when you get into the first part, the book itself is split into 3 different parts, and you get 3 different approaches to the writing. But really, the book itself is in more parts than that, because the introduction is a part of the book as well. It's part of the fiction, but he has already in the introduction blended fact with fiction. His own personal life of Dan Simmons with this fictional character. So he's injected himself into the story to try to get that sense of history and fiction have bled together in such a way that you can't actually tell when you're reading it what's real and what's not, what actually happened and what didn't happen, which is an impressive feat that he was able to do this. The other thing that's so interesting to me about doing this is that he's then come up with this super clever way. As a writer, I look at this and I'm like, how did you do this? Like look at what you did. You've just said, if there's something in the book that you don't like, if the writing style isn't quite your thing, or, and this is to all the critics, he's getting ahead of the critics before he even has published the thing. He's saying, if you don't like how much I go into the history of mountaineering, if you're not interested in, things like how oxygen tanks work and like the type of crampons that you're going to use on the mountain and different styles of ice picks that you can use, the traditional English style versus the new German style. If you think that that's too much, it's like, it's not my fault. Jake Perry wrote this. I'm just publishing his manuscripts, his memoirs. Like Dan Simmons, I didn't write this. This is Jake Perry. This is some whole other dude who's not a writer. These are just his memoirs. So if you don't like it, take it up with him, and he's dead. And so you can't, for one thing. And second of all, he's not a writer. So you can't really get upset at somebody for this. Just appreciate the story for what it is. And if you think that there are some parts that kind of drag, then it's like, well, let's be okay with that, because, we need to, we shouldn't be too critical of the text for that reason. Well, it's super clever, right? Because I think what it does is it allows Dan Simmons to nerd out like crazy on the history of mountaineering, while at the same time apologizing for it, saying like, I didn't do it. Personally, I thought it was too much, but I felt like I was obliged to do him the credit of publishing the entire thing, because he trusted me with this, and I think it's a good story. So you're just going to get the whole thing, and if you don't like parts of it, that's fine. So that's really interesting the way he does that. And then, like I say, you've got 3 parts to the novel itself, as far as 3 different parts to the memoirs. So part 1, the way the chapters are set up is he takes an interesting quotation from the chapter, and then he puts it just at the very top of the chapter, and then you kind of get surprised when you're reading partway through the chapter and you find that sentence, or there's 2 or 3 sentences in there. So the first one for the first chapter is, "The summit of the Matterhorn offers very clear choices. A misstep to the left and you die in Italy. A wrong step to the right and you die in Switzerland." And when I read that, I'm like, who do I attribute that quote to? Because there's no name underneath this. And then realizing, oh, these are quotations from Jake Perry, who didn't actually exist, but I got it. So that's the first part of it. The second part, the structure of it changes. So instead of having those quotations to start it, then instead you have dates. So then it becomes more of a climbing journal, because everything up to this is introducing who the people are who are going to climb Everest. And then in this, the second part, then you just get journal entries with dates. Then in the third part, and this is probably my favorite part, you get this little note to Dan Simmons from Jake Perry in his memoirs that he writes before he presumably mails it off. He says, "Note to Mr. Dan Simmons, up to this part, I've written out my story mostly in present tense because I was working from daily journal entries and climbing notes I'd made at the time in the summer and autumn of 1924 and spring of 1925. Writing in present tense helped bring those things alive and immediate for me again. I know that wasn't very professional of me in any writing sense, but this last section of my tale has been told to only one person and never written down at all, not even in my notes at the time. I write this part as I remember it now in past tense, never recorded at the time, but please understand that every word that I set down here is as true and as precise as I can remember and tell it, and that you will be the second person since 1925 to hear this part of the tale. Jake Perry." Okay, this is amazing. So literally the verb tense of the narration changes in part 3. The first 2 parts, he's writing it in present tense. And I can tell you, I am one of those people, I am one of those writers who I don't like fiction being written in the present tense. It really irritates me. If I get into the story enough, then I forget about it. But I don't like it. I don't like it for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into. And this is such a clever thing that Dan Simmons is doing, because he's essentially saying to the reader that, look, I know that present tense is not something that you're supposed to do as a writer, and here's why it shows up in the book. Again, challenging his critics before he even publishes the book. And then he's saying, but if you like past tense narration, I'll give you past tense narration as well in the third part of the book. The other thing that's so interesting to me is I kind of feel like it's Dan Simmons attacking the what is in vogue right now in fiction, where you're getting more and more writers who are writing in the present tense with their narration. Like Stephen King did this with the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, which I don't like, and he's never done this before in his narration. Those books are mostly written in the present tense, not entirely, but mostly. And that's because it's become very trendy to do this. And it's like Dan Simmons is saying, this is what bad writers do. Like, because he's saying in here, I know that you're not supposed to write in the present tense. You would never do that. So he's kind of got his cake and, you know, where he's got his cake and to eat it too, where he's got the present tense in this part of the book, and then he's got the past tense in this part of the book, and he's saying, what, this is what I'm supposed to do right now? I'm supposed to write in the present tense for my narration? Fine, there you go. I'll give you a book with present tense, but I'm also going to have a little passage in here saying, this is stupid, and this is bad writing, and this is, like, you shouldn't do it, and here, I'm going to give you my narration in the past tense. So I love that part. And then you get to the epilogue of the book, and, you know, the epilogue is very much like a continuation of the introduction, and notice that it's an introduction and not a prologue. And so really I think the epilogue is the epilogue is still part of Jake Perry, so that's part of his entry. But then you do get an afterword, and that's where it's interesting, is that the introduction and the afterword, even though he calls them an introduction and an afterword, as in it's paratext, it's not part of the novel itself. Instead, they really are a prologue and an epilogue. But he's already got the epilogue in there, but that's not really the epilogue. The epilogue is actually the afterword. And so the afterword is a continuation of Dan Simmons's introduction, where this stuff didn't happen. He never received these manuscripts from this guy Jake Perry, but this is all to convince you, the reader, that this actually happened. And this is where I'm saying that it's a horror trope. It's like going back to the show from the 90s, the cartoon Freaky Stories, you know, and it's like these horror stories where it's like, it's a true story, it happened to a friend of mine. And that's basically what he's doing. He's saying, look, this is a true story, and there's enough actual historical fact in here that it is challenging to figure out what's true and what isn't. And so I'm not spoiling everything with the book, and I won't get into all of the plot elements, but he's doing really interesting things with the plot itself, and you know, presenting things that are definitely fictional, but presenting them as though they are nonfiction, as though this is all historical fact, but it's just this close secret that really only Jake Perry has, who's then willing to share it with Dan Simmons. And so to me, that's just, there's so many fascinating things about that. If you're not into mountain climbing, I still think that you can enjoy the book, but you have to understand what he's doing, and you have to understand why he's doing it. And so I also think that it's like, if he's doing a good enough job, then you will become interested in why he's giving you all of these details. And he really does. Like, there are definitely sections of the book that I feel at the time I really questioned when I was reading this, thinking, why is it that you're telling me this, and why are you telling me that? And it just seems like this scene is so unnecessary. And this is not really spoiling anything, but it's like, you, like, the part that I really wondered about is that you get this like fairly long scene, or series of scenes going into the politics of Germany in the 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I. And at the time, I'm like, this seems really like a separate story. I don't understand why it's in here. And again, I'm not trying to give away everything in the book, but if you've read it, and if you've read to the end, then I think if you think back on those scenes, then you go, oh, that's why you were doing that. And I think there's a fair bit with the really taking the time to get into the minutia of alpinism, that there's a reason why he's doing that too, is he wants you to be so caught up in this that at times you feel like you're reading a historical text, that you're reading more of a biography than a novel. And whether he is effective or ineffective of that in doing that, I think that's up to the reader to decide. But I can say, speaking for myself, like, it was actually pretty effective, even when I know exactly what he's doing. It's like I got caught up at least in the introduction, and then in the novel itself. Then it's like I know that I'm not reading a biography, but he's imitating the style of a biography in order to get you to believe that what you're reading is actually real, in order to pull you into the story and allow you to suspend your disbelief to get to some of the pretty wild stuff that he gets to by the end of the book. So, if you haven't read it, then it's not a quick read. It's not an afternoon read. It's almost 700 pages, and and it is fairly dense at times. But I think it's really rewarding. And the one thing that I would say, I mean, I think this is true for most books, but the faster you can read it, the better. And I read it fairly quickly. I mean, it wasn't incredibly quick, but it was about a week or so. It took me about a week or so to get through the whole book, and that was really effective. So I would encourage you to do that too if you're interested in that. All right. Well, you can share comments below, and I will do my very best to respond to all of them. Thanks so much. Bye.